So, greetings, hello. It's Dr. Thomas Daffern here. Hello, welcome. It's the 27th of October, and a critical time, really, in our country's history, in Europe's history, concerning Brexit and the problems of the UK, what's it going to do. And this has taken a lot of energy from the other work we should all be doing, which is peacemaking, in my opinion. Reconciling conflict. Europe's energy should have been going into resolving conflicts in Syria, which has now broken out again, resolving the problems of the Ukraine and so on, solving the problems with Russia, getting a proper peace treaty with Russia and with America. Europe should be at peace with both these great superpowers and with China, and the European Union should have great trade deals with the USA, but also with Russia and with China. We can do it. Instead, we've been bickering about Brexit, which is a stupid nonsense and a waste of time, and is completely, polarising and destroying my beloved country, the United Kingdom. So I'm going to be speaking about all this. And we're in a critical and strange and dangerous place at the moment. On this day, Sunday the 27th of October, we're kind of in a Brexit limbo because we're waiting for Macron and the other European leaders to agree an extension beyond the 31st of October for the UK to remain inside the European Union, which I desperately hope they will agree, possibly even tomorrow, Monday. That's what they're saying. I would like that extension to be for at least 3 months to give us time to have a second referendum and a general election. I don't care which order that is in. I think it should actually be on the same day. Get it done with. We all go to the polls. We vote for which party, which MP we want to lead the country, and we also vote on a second referendum on the same day. That, to me, would be a fair, just, and honourable way of dealing with it. And then whoever is elected on that day, whichever MPs are returned to Parliament, they implement the referendum results. Personally, I would say that it is slightly complicated because if we had a situation again where, say, one country in the 4 that make up the UK voted still to come out of the EU, like let's say England still, I don't think it would, but let's just imagine England voted to leave, but Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland voted to stay in the EU. I don't think that the government should then implement that for the entire UK. I think really there should then be a second referendum, and the English should be asked, do you want to leave the UK as well as the EU? I think that if 3 countries out of the 4 vote to stay in the European Union, then they should get to stay. But anyway, it could be solved by just making it a second advisory referendum, and this time making it literally advisory so that, depending on the results, it wouldn't have to be implemented. I don't know. There is an argument, however, to have a general election next. And I can hear the Lib Dems and the SNP saying that we should go for a general election. I believe they're tabling a motion to that effect tomorrow in the hope that it will pass. For 2 reasons that I've heard. One is that the EU are more likely to grant a long extension if there is actually a general election. So that's incredibly important. The second is that notwithstanding all these polls predicting a great Tory landslide, I think that's completely facetious and facile. I don't think it's going to happen. People of the UK have had it with the Tory party. I don't believe they're going to get a majority. They're not in a majority at the moment. There is another view that we should have a referendum first instead of a general election. We have a parliament that is... would Parliament vote for a second referendum? I mean, if it would, then I would say go for it immediately. Don't need a general election, I think there should be 2 votes in Parliament. One is for a general election, which the Lib Dems are opposing with the SNP. I think that Labour should, if they're serious about this, go for a second referendum first. and the government would have to then implement it if that passes in the House. You know, I'm not going to comment further on parliamentary strategy because I'm not, fortunately, a parliamentarian. I'm a philosopher looking on at a distance. The very first legislation I would pass in any parliament, in that parliament, is the legal duty to tell the truth. Until our parliamentarians have to tell the truth by law, we can never know if they're lying or not. So I think there's enough evidence to show that the Tory party, led by Boris Johnson and his crony Dominic Cummings, have become industrial-scale liars. We've had Peter Oborne, who wrote the book on political lying, stating as much, and he studies all the details of this. They're putting out of Downing Street absolute fake news all the time, which I think is absolutely scandalous and shocking, and a bill to outlaw lying in Parliament would just get rid of that, nip it in the bud. It's got to be done. I mean, it's sad that we should need it. Of course, when I was a boy growing up in the 60s in Britain, one felt that parliamentarians told the truth. They may disagree, they may be a Tory or a Labour, but they told the truth from their perspective. We've now got to the place where people lie to Parliament. I think, therefore, legislation is necessary to outlaw that. It's sad and tragic that it's necessary, but I think it is. And that's why I've set up the Campaign Against Political Lying, which is now got its own website, and you can Google that, you'll find it. I think it's absolutely vital, and anyone that wants to help, I've written to selected MPs that I believe have integrity. You see, you can tell when an MP is not lying, you can tell when they're telling the truth, and not just the truth in their interest, but the actual truth. We have Marianne Williamson in America, a brilliant candidate for president, saying exactly the same. Only she makes the point that they should tell not just the truth, but the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. She's very eloquent on that. Obviously, yes, but I don't think you can legislate for that, because people may not know the whole truth. I think some of these Brexiteering MPs, they don't know the whole truth, because they've deliberately either avoided it, or they've been so miseducated by the narrow-minded British education system, which fails to give people a general knowledge. It fails to give people a general grasp of all subjects. I lament this. As a philosophy and religious studies teacher, I always try to supplement what the other departments aren't doing in schools. For instance, you can do science education and never learn about the history of science, never learn about the philosophy of science. You can do maths education for hours and hours in secondary school, never learn about the history of mathematics, don't even know there is such a thing. The exciting adventure of inventing numbers and so on, and discovering zero and inventing algebra. So kids are not taught in Britain, sadly, because the curriculum has been so dumbed down. I think this is all a deliberate strategy of the Tories when they created this concept of a national curriculum. What they were trying to do was to take control of the curriculum and engineer it for their own political purposes. I think the national curriculum should be abolished, I'm sorry. We need freedom to free up the curriculum so heads, teachers can teach from the heart. Obviously there have to be common standards, exams, systems and so on, but much less emphasis on that, thank you very much. Much more on actually educating people. I once had a headmaster telling me, Thomas, stop educating your pupils. Just teach to the exam so they get a maximum number of marks. Just teach the exam syllabus exactly as it is. Don't educate them anymore. I'm afraid I resigned from that school immediately. I served out, till the end of the year, but I was shocked that a headmaster would tell me not to educate people. But that's where we've been reduced to as a country. So what do you get? Well, obviously you get politicians, the product of that system, who may have, good exam results, but they can't join up 3 or 4 separate thoughts. They just do the one thing, and what this lot have been doing is Brexit. They can't see, Scottish independence, yeah, that's going to follow, Northern Ireland chaos, resumption of troubles, that will follow on. No, they can't do that because that involves joining up 2 or 3 separate thoughts. So it's a scandalous implication following on from our failed education system, which is about pigeonholing people into specific curricular niches. Oh, you're going to do physics, science at Oxford, fine. So you don't need to do languages or music or art or drama. You don't need to have the whole conversation of the whole muses. That's why I run the Museum of the Muses. As a philosopher, I believe all the conversations of the muses, all 9 of them, are part of our heritage as human beings. That's what European civilization stands for. It's what British civilization, as part of European civilization, stands for. Joined upness, philosophical depth. That's why I taught at Oxford. They still haven't forgotten this. And London University too. We value connectivity. The very word intellect means the ability to join up stuff. Intellect, words and ideas that can be connected. And that's how the brain works. It fires up all the neurons and interconnects. And we have millions, trillions of these interconnections. That's what our human beingness is premised on. Now, the Brexit types don't do this joined up thinking, bless them. And so we're stuck in this limbo. And so I tried to get all parliamentary group for philosophy going as a mere academic. I still think we need one. I think these parliamentarians should, invite in leading intellectuals, philosophers, to come and talk to them about logic, because they're so lacking in fundamental, conceptual consequences of actions and logic and ethics. They need a philosophy club. I'd be happy to go in on a Wednesday afternoon once a month, and we can use a committee room. We'll do some philosophy teaching. Give me a ring. Okay, but we can only pray that something comes out of this chaos this coming week. We either get a general election, we get an extension, or we get a second referendum. But one thing we can't have is some kind of hard Brexit for Halloween, 31st of October. This would be like the worst possible nightmare for our country and for Europe. I don't think that's going to happen. By law, Johnson can't go for that. But they're still mad enough to be arguing that's going to happen. So here we are on a knife edge. Welcome to the human condition. As the Zen master said, life is like you've fallen off a cliff. You're holding onto a tree, and you can feel a nice lick of honey on the knife that's about to kill you. A bit gloomy that. I'm a bit more of a positivist and utopian visionary than that. But I do believe in compassion and the law of love, the law of ahimsa, or non-harmfulness, as Alice Bailey calls it in her wonderful autobiography. She translates ahimsa as non-harming, non-harmfulness. We're having a big conference with the Jains in India in December about non-harmfulness. What is it? Well, I can tell you Brexit is harm. It's harm to the people, harm to the businesses of Britain, harm to the ordinary Europeans and Brits that like to visit and travel and work and love in each other's countries. It's harm to people like me who've chosen to come and live in Europe. But we still are British, we still have votes, and I've been a teacher in Britain for 30 years. It's my cultural homeland, even if I'm now in exile, like Thomas à Becket had to flee to France. Anyway, so greetings. Let's move on. I want to look at the saints and sages for today, and address my remarks about Brexit through the lens of today's saints and sages, because as anyone that's spent time with me or been a student of mine or come and studied here at the Museum of the Muses, or the Castle of the Muses in Scotland, knows I have this wonderful calendar of universal saints and sages, which I produced first as a secondary school teacher, and then I've augmented it ever since to include saints and sages, scholars from all traditions. These are my colleagues, as it were, from all of history. To get in this book, you have to be dead, so it's one of those things. There is a second book that I'm working on for living ones, but that's difficult. They keep dying off. People like Father Thomas Keating, he was alive and now he's gone. But let's celebrate today and look at what they would say about this Brexit nonsense. Let's get some insight, gleanings, so to speak. So we have a beautiful Japanese writer, Sei Shonagon, who lived around the time of 966 to 1013. She wrote a famous pillow book of comments from the courts and the poetry and so on. And she cared about life. She cared about love. She wanted, men and women to enjoy each other's company and the thrill of that. Well, don't we all? That's what life's for, and that's why the European Union is so great, because you can, go and have a coffee in Prague and meet beautiful people, and then you can, get a plane to Austria and go and spend time. Well, you wouldn't need a plane to Austria. You just get the train down to Vienna, and go and explore that and listen to some Beethoven. Then go to London and meet some wonderful people there. I mean, we are one country, one culture, each with our nuances and differences. And all the great literary figures of Europe have known this. Then we come to Salomon Trimazan, who was a mystic teacher of Paracelsus, who wrote the Golden Fleece, the Splendor Solis, and I commemorated him today in prayers. Well, he's one of Europe's rich esoteric traditions. Every European country has these amazing mystics and esotericists, occultists they could be called. Now, occult simply means hidden. It's not, strange, it's just hidden from normal ken, because people, when they live on the surface of things, the surface life, don't delve into the depths. The occult is the hidden energies behind ordinary existence. And people like Salomon Trimazan really studied that. Then we celebrate also Sun Shu, a great Chinese historian today, who lived in the 3rd century AD. And then our Jewish thinker of the day is Jacob Frank, who is a great Jewish mystic. I have a lot of time for him, always have, who was way ahead of his time. He was from, actually, a rabbi, and he became the an important rabbi. He was from Poland and Galicia, and he wanted so much to see reconciliation between the world's religions. He knew as an esoteric Kabbalist that all these great religions come from one source. So you've seen my periodic table. All the colours come from the one light. And I have these candles out to celebrate Diwali today, because Diwali is happening to my friends in India and all my Indian friends in Britain and throughout Europe. And each colour represents a different ray or different faith path. And dear old Jacob Frank knew that there's ultimately one unity behind them all, the white light, if you want. And he felt that, therefore, the split between Judaism and Christianity and Islam and all the other religions was actually offensive to God. If God is that divine unity underlying everything, as Newton said of colour, and Newton also said of theology, he wrote a theological text that was suppressed. It wasn't translated in his lifetime until much, much later. Published not until 1950s in Liverpool, at the Liverpool University Press, where he talked about the white common light universally flowing within all religions. Now that was Jacob Frank's point of view. And so Jacob said, look, Christians, Christ was just another God-intoxicated rabbi who'd supped from the Kabbalistic streams of wisdom that I've supped from as a Jewish Kabbalist. It's the same thing. You can recognise him. And I would 100% agree. That's why in my commentaries on the New Testament, the Gospels, including the Gnostic Gospels of Thomas and Mary Magdalene, I've gone into the common core, esoteric roots of that teaching and tried to explain from within, so to speak. Now, Jacob Frank said, therefore, look, I'm Jewish, but I'm at one with my Christian brothers and sisters, with my Muslim Sufi brothers and sisters. Had he known about it, he would have said with my Druid brothers and sisters in Western Europe, etc., etc. The American Indian religion, he didn't know about that. Or the Taoist, the saints of each culture and tradition have reached that universal place and are one in that. That's what the true meaning of the word, the communion of saints, is. And that's what, to me, political unity, like the European Union, is an attempt to represent on the earth temporal political plane, or like the United Nations. The founders of these great institutions that stress universality and common universal values have reached that plane. Most of them were very enlightened people like Jean Monnet and so on. If you look at them, they have towering intellectual vision of that unity. And the same with Kojève, the great Hegelian philosopher who worked for the European Union, or Denis de Rougemont, who helped create its cultural dimensions. So Jacob Frank, 1726 to 1791, he was about 300 or 400 years too soon, because he saw this common universality of all the faiths. He said, look, I'm going to, to show I'm serious about this, I'll be baptized. He was baptized, therefore, into the Catholic or Universal Church in the cathedral in Warsaw, in Poland. And the Polish King Emperor Augustus III was his godfather, and everything was going fine. He was saying, as a Jew, I embrace my Christian brothers and sisters. He was embarrassed at all the anti-Christian content of some parts of the Talmud, which have got a very anti-Christian bias in them, and they call Mary, the mother of Jesus, a prostitute, and they're very denigrating of Jesus. They say, oh, he's a petty little magician who learned stuff in Egypt and a fake, etc. Not very respectful and not very good for interfaith relations. So Frank said, no, I'm not one of those rabbinical Talmudic Jews that hate Christians. I'm going to be baptized. Well, what a beautiful and brave thing to have done. Sadly, of course, it backfired, because then the Christians didn't understand where he was coming from either. They weren't universal enough, those particular Catholics. And he was incarcerated and accused of heresy against the Catholic Church. And he was stuck in a prison, and he remained there for 13 years. Blimey, this is terrible. This is like this poor Russian woman that was just released last night in Moscow, having been flown back from the States, where she was in prison for a year or something, and stuck in solitary confinement just for not having the right paperwork. But this guy, it was 13 years. Why? Because he was a universal mystic, and he was wanting to break free from the boxes of particularity. He was a visionary. And that, I feel, is what the European Union stands for. I mean, Jacob Frank would feel totally at home in the European Union, because he could roam around, meet Jews, meet Christians, meet all the other faiths of humanity, all the different, you can go to Southall and meet all the Sikhs, or go to the West Country and meet all the Druids, go to Wales, meet the Bards, etc. Europe is full of this multitude of complexity, which is our beauty, it's our multicolouredness. And there's all the other traditions here. And I'm including Britain in that complex mix. One of the reasons I love London is it's such a cosmopolitan city. It's got, the whole world in microcosm, which is why when I started teaching for the University of London, I was always stressing the interfaith stuff. Now, Jacob Frank saw all this, but because of, it was not politically correct to point to universality and peace. So he was stuck in prison for 13 years. When he came out, finally, in 1786, he settled in Offenbach, near Frankfurt, where he and his daughter Eva presided over the headquarters of his tradition, which was trying to start this universality. And it's tragic what had happened to him. I mean, really, he was born 300 years too early. He should have been born in San Francisco and taught at Esalen. They are Frankists, effectively. The whole alternative movement that developed in the States in the 60s, and in Britain, the Stonehenge, underground Druid culture that was there on the west coast of California and here in Wessex was universal, like Jacob Frank's ideas. Also, another thing, he was very aware of the importance of sexuality for that energy, that eros flow force that gives us the power of heart to speak truth to power. You have to be a lover of life and an appreciator of eros. So he was, in a sense, a kind of tantric mystic before it was studied or known about. It was before Sir John Woodruff had translated all these tantric texts from India. Sages in the British Empire were going off to India and beginning to realise Tantra was an incredibly sophisticated thing. But it was still the early days. Jacob had got it from his own Kabbalistic sources, because in the Kabbalah, sex is the most incredibly holy thing. And love is the purest form of communion that we're capable of doing on this plane of being. Socrates was once asked, had he ever been in love? His response was to laugh and say, my dear friend, there's never been a time I haven't been in love. You know, that's a master speaking, someone that knows that life is made of love. So it's like asking me, have I ever seen light? It's all around me. You know, that's why Diwali is celebrated. So yes, so we celebrate him today, and his universality, it seems, is a total wake-up call for those against the narrow-mindedness that Brexit represents. That's what upsets me as an educator. You know, to sort of stick my identity into a little box called Britishness or Englishness or UKness. I mean, come on, I'm a European, I'm a cosmic citizen, I'm a citizen of the kingdom of God. As a Christian, I'm also a citizen of the kingdom of God. I deserve my entrance right to see and mingle and meet with my fellow citizens of the kingdom of God. Or the kingdom of the goddess, you know, in the Shekinah tradition of Kabbalah and Kabbalistic Christianity, it's the kingdom of the goddess. We should be trying to build unity on this planet, not disunity. And Brexit is a disunity project, it's a separation, it's an apartheid project. And it's not surprising lots of people that supported apartheid in South Africa are also now clamouring for Brexit. I've noticed. Okay, then we come to celebrate a great Sufi intellectual, Mirza Muhammad Baqir Qamsari from Iran, who was a scholar in the 19th century, 1811 to 1895, author of the Rawzat al-Jannat, an encyclopedia of religious scholars. So here we have a great Islamic saint doing a kind of equivalent to the book I've produced. He did a compendium of all the religious scholars within Islam, but it was still a great towering achievement. We honour him. We celebrated also the pagan scholar Ancus Martius and the sage, writer, philosopher Samuel Beckett, who lived from 1906 to 1988. And Samuel Beckett, I think, lived at a time when life was very difficult, full of difficult choices. He was Irish and had studied at Trinity College at the University in Dublin, which I know and love well, the university there. And he, a highly intelligent man, he went to Paris soon after graduation, became a lecturer in English at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. Then he went back to Trinity and taught French at Trinity College in Dublin. But from 1932 onwards, he was born in 1906, by the way, he taught mostly, or he lived mostly in France. He became secretary to James Joyce, a writer and intellectual I also greatly respect. And they had, you know, many common interests. He was writing poetry and two early novels, and then plays. And of course, Waiting for Godot, 1953 in French. He wrote it in French. And then Endgame, Fin de Partie, 1957. This represents the kind of bleak existentialism of the 50s and 60s that I grew up with in polite society. You know, there's no God, there's no hope, there's only sort of human endeavour, there's the agonising bootstrap that we have to do to bring progress to humanity. There's you know, if you're on the left, there'd be the Communist Party, and maybe that will help. During World War II, Beckett was in France, and he did support the French resistance. He made this agonising choice that, yes, Nazism is an evil. You have to stand against it. And his political activism was eventually evil gets so bad you can't just sit and write. You have to do stuff. And I think he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1969, and I remember my mother, Eileen Daffern, had in her library in Kemp Town, Brighton, I grew up, you know, there, a wonderful quote from Samuel Beckett, which was something like, to paraphrase, you know, tried, failed, tried again, failed again, tried yet again, failed harder, must try better. You know, so it's a triumphant, in spite of the bleakness and cruelty and horror of humanity, in spite of the Nazis, in spite of World War II, in spite of the horrors of genocide and anti-Semitism and racism and ignorance, all the fruits of human ignorance, in spite of all that, we have to keep trying. That was Beckett's triumphant message for humanity. He faced that void, that bleakness, and said we have to keep trying. And I would say the same about Brexit. It's the most stupid nightmare we've been living through for 3 years. We can't stop, we can't give up, we can't sort of let that evil, which is what it is, it's an ignorance, which becomes an evil. You see, as a philosopher, I know that evil comes out of ignorance. And ignorance is this tendency human beings have to ignore things. The etymology is absolutely clear. Ignorance is that tendency you have to look away. If something annoys you or makes you think, you ignore it. So ignorance is that tendency in human beings to simply push under the carpet stuff we can't deal with. Well, Brexit is the mother of all carpets. It's been opened up, and it showed us the can of worms that ignorance can collectively accumulate. It happened in Yugoslavia when stuff had been pushed under the carpet and it was all rolled away and poor old Yugoslavia fell apart. I'm trying to stop that happening to the UK because it would be a nightmare. It already is a nightmare. But if it carries on, and if Brexit actually happens, it'll be much worse. And with all due respect, Machiavellian, diabolic figures like Steve Bannon are rolling up their sleeves laughing. They can't wait for the chaos and catastrophe because it plays into their idea of a militarised, super surveillance state where nothing is permitted apart from what the intelligence services let you do. And the last thing they let you do is actually be intelligent. So Marianne Williamson is absolutely right to be clamouring and jumping up and down and saying the American people should reread their constitution, which is the right to life, liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Now that's absolutely central. Thomas Jefferson, I think, wrote those words, and he was an intellectual like me. He knew the highest form of happiness is intellectual aha moments. It's when you capture the questing beast or the holy grail of knowledge. And there is light at the end of the tunnel of this Brexit saga. We as a country have learned what it is to stare into the abyss and what happens when we ignore stuff. Yes, people neglected the East Midlands, people neglected the council estates, people neglected the poor in Britain. I worked among them, I've taught in these hopeless, no-hope areas, which largely all voted Brexit. I didn't neglect them. I went and taught God studies because they deserve the truth just like any other, leafy part of Surrey or Wiltshire where they can afford private education. So yes, we have to totally up the game of our education system. Once Brexit is shot down, we need an absolute reform of the UK education system, and we have to make it much more multidisciplinary, multi-dimensional, tailored to individual learning needs. Schools really need to rethink their game. And one thing we all need is citizenship education in schools, where we learn about our country and its democracy and its customs and its... Because I was teaching kids that literally didn't know Scotland existed, or didn't know about Northern Ireland, didn't understand what the UK is. They thought they lived in this thing called England. And that's what if that's what's going on, you get Brexit. So yes, totally up the game intellectually and educationally. Much more philosophy, and I would say less maths, because maths is just calculating. Anyone can do that, It's just robotic stuff. We need proper joined up thinking, intellectual capacity and philosophy in our schools, which we have